When I took the job as a food delivery man, I never expected it to be anything but mundane. Working late-night shifts wasn't ideal, but I needed the money. I spent most nights biking around the city, delivering greasy meals to tired customers. The roads were usually quiet, and that was fine by me. Tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with an uneasy stillness, the kind that made your skin crawl without knowing why. I picked up my first order, a late-night snack for someone in an old, run-down apartment complex on the edge of town. As I biked through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The streets, usually illuminated by dim streetlights, seemed darker tonight. I arrived at the apartment, locked my bike, and headed up the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was barely lit, casting long shadows that twisted as I walked. I knocked on the door of apartment 4 billion, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. A gaunt, pale man peered through the crack, his bloodshot eyes barely focusing on me as he grabbed the bag of food. He didn't say a word, just took the food and shut the door. On my way back to the bike, I caught a glimpse of something dark at the end of the hallway. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. Just shadows. My imagination was running wild. I shook it off and biked to the next delivery, a small house further away from the city. The ride took me through a quiet neighborhood, but the eerie silence made the familiar roads seem foreign. When I arrived, the house was barely visible, the porch light broken. The house itself was old, the windows dark and lifeless. I walked up to the door, delivered the food, and turned to leave, but I froze when I heard whispering coming from inside. It wasn't loud, just faint, like someone whispering secrets in the dark. I hesitated for a moment before heading back to my bike. The whispers grew louder as I stepped onto the porch. It felt like they were coming from every direction, surrounding me. I could hear faint sobs mixed in, the sound clinging to me like a thick fog. I pedaled away as fast as I could, trying to put distance between me and whatever was happening in that house. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone following me. But the streets behind me were empty, save for the shadows that seemed to stretch further with each passing second. By the time I reached the diner to end my shift, I was drenched in sweat. The usual late-night crowd was missing, and the diner was eerily quiet. I told myself it was just the lateness of the hour, the emptiness of the streets, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me back. Frank, the cook, barely looked at me as I clocked out. "You all right?" he asked, glancing at me with a concerned expression. I nodded, but my hands were still trembling. As I left the diner and unlocked my bike, I heard something, a faint whisper, just like the one from the house. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but no one was there. The streets were as empty as ever, but I could still feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. The ride home was a blur of paranoia and fear. Every street seemed darker, every alley felt like a trap. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, staying just out of sight. The whispers never stopped, growing fainter and louder as I pedaled, like they were dancing in and out of my mind. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed onto my bed, but sleep never came. Every creak, every rustle outside my window felt like a threat. And as I lay there in the dark, I realized something. Whatever had been in that house, whatever had been watching me in those shadowy streets, it wasn't finished with me. The whispers haven't stopped since. Being a food delivery guy sounds like a simple job, right? You pick up the food, you drop it off, you move on to the next order. But the thing no one tells you is that doing it at night, especially on a bike, isn't as easy as it seems. My name's Josh, and I've been working for this diner on the edge of town for the past year. It's a greasy, 24-hour joint that gets a lot of late-night orders from people who either can't sleep or are just looking for something to soak up the alcohol. The job used to feel routine. I'd hop on my bike, make my deliveries, and call it a night. But after tonight, I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same way about those quiet, empty streets again. It all started around 11 p.m., the beginning of my shift. I grabbed a couple of orders and headed out into the night. I've always preferred taking my bike. It's quicker in traffic and helps me save on gas. Plus, riding through the city at night had a certain peacefulness to it. That is, until tonight. The first delivery was at an old apartment building on Ash Street, one of those rundown places with graffiti on the walls and cracked windows. I'd been there plenty of times, so I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. The ride there was quiet, with nothing but the sound of my tires on the pavement and the occasional hum of a distant car engine. The streets were empty, as usual. When I got to the building, I locked my bike to the fence and walked up the crumbling steps. The light in the hallway was flickering, casting weird shadows on the cracked walls. I knocked on the door of apartment 3 billion, and after a long pause, it creaked open just a sliver. A pale hand shot out, grabbed the bag of food, and the door slammed shut without so much as a thanks typical. I shrugged it off and headed back to my bike, ready for the next delivery. But as I was unlocking my bike, something caught my eye. Across the street, standing just beyond the dim glow of a street lamp, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a person waiting for a bus or something, but there wasn't a bus stop anywhere near here. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and completely still. It was like they were watching me. I blinked, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was just some drunk guy, or maybe I was seeing things. I glanced around, hoping to see someone else on the street, but it was dead quiet. My heart started to pound a little faster, and I felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of my neck. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what was going on, so I jumped on my bike and pedaled away fast. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, though. Even as I sped through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following me. I kept looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure there, but every time I looked, the street behind me was empty. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Long shifts and little sleep were probably getting to me. But as I rode toward my next stop, the unease only grew. It felt like every shadow, every dark corner was hiding something. I couldn't hear anything behind me, but the silence was deafening. I arrived at the next delivery, a rundown house at the far end of Elm Street, the kind of place where the roof sags and the paint is peeling off in chunks. The street was deserted, no cars, no lights, nothing. I walked up to the door, knocked, and waited. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and still nothing. I turned around to go back to my bike, and that's when I saw it again. The figure. It was standing at the far end of the street, completely still, just like before. My stomach dropped. It was closer this time, not as far away as when I'd first seen it. I could make out the vague shape of it, but it was like looking at a shadow that had pulled itself up from the ground and taken human form. My first thought was to run, but my bike was parked right near the figure. I'd have to walk toward it to get out of here. My legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the ground, but I forced myself to move. Each step I took felt harder than the last, like my body was resisting the idea of getting any closer to that thing. I reached my bike, my hands trembling as I fumbled to unlock the chain. The figure hadn't moved, but I could feel it watching me. I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a weight. My breathing was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears as I jumped on my bike and took off down the street. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The thought of that thing standing there, watching me, maybe even following me, was too much. I pedaled faster than I ever had, my legs burning with the effort, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to the diner. As I rode, the shadows seemed to shift around me. Every dark alley, every unlit corner felt like it was hiding something. I told myself it was just the adrenaline, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there. Something had followed me from that apartment building, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. When I finally made it back to the diner, I burst through the door, breathless and sweating. The cook, a grizzled guy named Frank, who'd seen his share of weirdos in this town, looked up from the grill with a raised eyebrow. "You all right, kid?" he asked, flipping a burger. I saw something, I stammered, leaning against the counter for support. He chuckled. "Yeah? What'd you see? A raccoon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, trying to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you describe something like that? A shadow, a figure that shouldn't be there, standing in the middle of the street like it's waiting for you. Frank didn't get it, of course. He just laughed it off, told me to get a cup of coffee and take a breather. But I couldn't relax. Even inside the diner, with its familiar greasy smells and the low hum of the radio playing some old blues song, I felt on edge. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that figure standing in the parking lot. I didn't see it, but that didn't make me feel any better. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I finished my shift in a daze, barely noticing the time pass. When my shift ended, I grabbed my bike and headed home, but the ride was different now. Every shadow felt alive. Every flickering streetlight seemed to hide something waiting to step out and follow me again. I've been doing night shifts for months, and I've seen my share of weird things. Drunks stumbling around, late night fights breaking out in alleyways, even the occasional guy trying to sell me something shady. But this was something else. That figure, whatever it was, wasn't just some weirdo hanging around. It wasn't a person. I know that now. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. And the worst part, I don't think it's done with me. Every night since, I've felt it. Watching, waiting. I haven't seen it again, but I know it's out there, lurking in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the streetlights. And one of these nights I'm going to see it again. Maybe it'll be closer next time. Maybe it'll finally move. And when that happens, I'm not sure I'll be fast enough to get away. I've been delivering food for the better part of 5 years now, mostly at night. It's not an exciting job, but the late night orders tend to tip well, especially if you don't mind the weird hours. I never minded being out at night. There's a certain calm to it, with fewer people on the streets and the city almost empty, like it's sleeping. I always liked the stillness. I deliver on a bike. I started doing it back when I was a student, trying to make a few bucks between classes, and I just never stopped. I guess the physical activity helps me unwind, even after a long shift. Plus, it's quicker to cut through the back streets and alleyways when the traffic's bad, or when you're delivering to those parts of the city where people tend to avoid. It was one of those nights when the air was colder than usual, biting into my skin as I pedaled through the nearly deserted streets. It was close to midnight, and I was already considering calling it a night when a notification popped up on my phone. New order. The address looked unfamiliar. It wasn't in the usual area where I worked. It was in the old industrial district on the outskirts of the city, a place I knew only from passing through once or twice during the day. The streets there are lined with long abandoned warehouses, factories that used to hum with life, but have now turned into decaying skeletons of the city's past. People didn't live there. At least I didn't think they did. But a job was a job, and I needed the cash. So I accepted the order. The order was simple: a large pepperoni pizza from this 24-hour joint downtown. Nothing fancy, no special instructions. But the thing that struck me as odd was the delivery time. It wasn't common to get an order that late in that part of town. Still, I picked up the pizza, strapped the box to the insulated carrier on the back of my bike, and started pedaling. The further I went, the more isolated the streets became. The warm glow of the streetlights gradually disappeared, replaced by the cold, dim lights that flickered every few blocks. The road beneath my tires grew rougher, cracks and potholes making my ride jittery. I should have turned around, then something about the place made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, but I pushed on. After about 20 minutes, I arrived. The address led me to a massive, decrepit warehouse. The windows were shattered, and what was left of the glass was thick with grime. The metal walls were covered in rust, and the place looked like it hadn't seen life in decades. The only sign that someone might be inside was a single light above the door, flickering erratically. I stopped a few feet away, staring at the building. I felt uneasy, like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone around. The air here was heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I glanced at the address on my phone again. It was correct. I took a deep breath and walked my bike closer. The door looked heavy and old, like it would creak loudly if I tried to open it. There wasn't a doorbell, no buzzer, just a rusty knocker hanging on the front. I tapped it twice. The sound echoed unnervingly in the quiet night, but there was no immediate response. I knocked again, louder this time. And then, from somewhere inside the building, I heard the faintest shuffle, like something or someone moving slowly. The door creaked open just an inch, but no one was standing behind it. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. "Food delivery." Nothing. I debated leaving the pizza at the door and pedaling the hell out of there. But just as I turned to leave, I heard a voice, low, raspy, and coming from somewhere deep inside. "Bring it in here." It wasn't the kind of voice you'd expect. It didn't sound right. It was too deep, too hollow, like it wasn't coming from a person at all. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, but against all logic, I stepped forward. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something else, something I couldn't explain. I leaned my bike against the side of the warehouse, and hesitating for just a moment, pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound making me wince. The inside of the warehouse was just as eerie as the outside, dimly lit, with long, dark corridors that seemed to stretch forever. The smell hit me almost immediately. It was rancid, sour, like rotting meat, but it wasn't coming from the pizza. I should have turned back. I know that now. But some pull I couldn't shake kept me moving forward. I followed the narrow hallways, each step I took making the floor creak under my weight. The further I went, the worse the smell became. The air was thick and oppressive, clinging to my skin. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. "Bring it in," the voice came again, more insistent this time. It was close now. I turned the corner and came to a large, metal door, slightly ajar. Behind it, I could hear the faint clink of plates and the shuffling of feet. My hands shook as I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was large and dimly lit, with a long wooden table at the center. Plates piled with food sat in the middle, but the food was wrong. There was raw meat, organs that I didn't recognize, and bowls filled with thick, congealed liquids that made my stomach churn just from the sight of them. The pizza I was carrying seemed absurdly out of place, like a joke in the middle of a nightmare. But it wasn't just the food. Sitting around the table were 3 figures. They were still unnaturally so, like statues. Their skin looked wrong. Loose, almost as if it was barely clinging to their bones, pale and waxy. None of them moved as I stepped further into the room, though I could feel their eyes on me, even if I couldn't see them clearly. One of the figures slowly turned its head toward me, the movement stiff, as if its muscles didn't work properly. Its face, if you could call it that, was sunken and gaunt, with hollow eyes that were nothing but black voids. The skin hung from its cheeks, and its lips were thin, cracked, and slightly parted, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth underneath. I stood frozen in place, gripping the pizza box like it was some kind of shield. I have your food," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure stood up slowly, moving with a strange, jerking motion, like a marionette being pulled by strings. Its head twitched to the side, and for a moment, I thought it was smiling, but the expression was too twisted to be anything close to human. The other two figures remained seated, their heads tilted slightly, as if they were listening, but they didn't move. The standing figure took a step toward me, and I took a step back, my heart racing. I should go," I managed to choke out. But as I turned to leave, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a wet, gurgling noise, followed by a deep, rattling breath. I looked back and saw the figure moving toward me, its mouth hanging open now, emitting that low, guttural noise, like it was struggling to form words. I didn't wait to see what it was trying to say. I bolted. My feet pounded the floor as I ran back through the hallways, the sound of the figure's shuffling footsteps behind me growing louder. I grabbed my bike, my hands trembling as I hopped on and pedaled as hard as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the cold wind cutting into my face as I raced down the empty streets. I never went back to that part of town again. Whatever I had seen that night, those people, if you could even call them, that they weren't human. They weren't customers looking for a pizza. They were something much, much worse. Something that still haunts me every time I close my eyes.